In the first part of our little nerd session that we're having here, I want to talk about what we do, why we do, and to a certain extent also how we do what we do. Okay, I would like to keep this as interactive as possible. So if I should be too fast, too slow, too German or something like that, just feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any questions. Okay? So my goal is that you all have a good understanding of why we do what we do, how it can be applied, and ideally, why you can never live without it again. Okay? Right. So at KLANG, we call what we do immersive in-ear monitoring. The professional term for that would be binaural in-ear monitoring. Binaural hearing describes our ability as human beings to hear three-dimensional in real life. Okay? But as you might have noticed last time you looked into a mirror, we don't have 5.1 ears. We don't have ears all around our head. We only have 2 ears. So how is it even possible that we can localize sounds all around us? Because we can spot pretty exactly if a sound is coming from there, above us, below us, and so on. 2 ears. That leads to the quite common misunderstanding that stereo would be the correct way to listen to audio, right? But if you look back into the history of sound reinforcement, you know, when the very first speakers were built, even then we were aware that we hear three-dimensional. But it was in no shape or form possible on a technological level to actually pull immersive audio off at that time. At some point, we got to the convention, okay, so at least let's use 2 speakers. So we can at least have like a little bit of a sound stage there. But that was not the end of the road. Over the last 10-ish years, immersive audio has become quite a word, right? So it's pretty much everywhere right now. And the reason for that is not that it's just a hip thing or that it's a marketing buzzword or something like that. It's just that at a technological level, we are now ready to actually deploy that in a way that is actually usable. There are quite a few speaker manufacturers who are doing immersive audio for the audience. There's also quite recently Dolby Atmos coming quite strongly into the presence with immersive audio for consumer audio, right? And those platforms are using immersive audio mainly for entertainment, right? So we want to make it exciting for the audience. We want to have stuff fly around and make it really, really cool and exciting. We are using immersive audio on a much more pragmatic level. We are going to get that in more detail in a little bit. But first, let's talk about how it's even possible that we can hear immersively with only 2 ears. Our brain is constantly analyzing the sound that arrives at our head. And it's especially looking for 3 factors: level, time, and coloration. Let's go through those in detail. The level part, I think, is relatively obvious and intuitive. If a sound is coming from over there, I'm going to hear it louder on this side than on that side. It's pretty much the same thing that we can do with a panning button on a mixing board. Delay. If a sound is coming from over there, it's first going to hit that ear and then that ear, just due to speed of sound. But to make that a little bit more interesting, it is not a linear delay, something that we could do with a delay button on a mixing board. I mean, the monitor folks, you probably are using sometimes stuff like the Haas effect, right? To just create a little bit more width and move the signals a little bit independently from loudness panning. But in reality, our brain is not only looking at that, but there is a frequency-dependent delay between left and right ear. To simplify that a little bit, the lower frequencies that are coming from that side in my example will first, of course, hit that side, and then they will kind of wobble around the head and hit the other side, and they will be subject to the speed of sound of air. while the higher frequencies, typically something around 4K and above, will be traveling through the head. And they will be subject to the speed of sound of our brain matter, which is different than the one of air. We're talking about tiny, tiny differences, but our brain is quick enough to pick up on those. And it's actually a very crucial part of that. And the third factor is probably the most powerful one. It's a coloration. Depending on the angle of sound that arrives at our head, it gets reflected by specific points of our earlobe into our ear canal. And depending on the shape and consistency of those points, each angle of sound sounds a little bit different. We call it a frequency signature. Okay? I have here a little graph that represents one example of one angle. If we would put measurement mics into our eardrums, it would look something like that for this specific angle. So you can see that on the right side, it is relatively linear, relatively. As you can see, it is not really linear, right? You can see some quite drastic dips and boosts in there. Those are basically just coming from the reflections of the different points of our earlobes. On the left side, we can see that it goes relatively linear up about until 4K. And then there's a relatively drastic dip down there. This is where the frequencies are just traveling through the head and they get shielded by the head, right? So that's why that's quite a bit lower in level. And that brings the question, can we even hear linear? You know, I mean, not sure. Do we have any studio people here? Yeah? Okay. So you might or might not have invested quite a bit of money into a linear room, linear speakers, and now the German comes and tells you, you can't hear linear. It must be frustrating. Well, it's true. No human being can hear linear. It's absolutely impossible on an anatomical level. However, it's still okay what you did, because we perceive audio linear. It's a small difference, but a crucial one. Our brain is constantly analyzing those three factors, including the coloration. It calculates angles, and then it counteracts those effects in our perception. Very similar to what a systems engineer is doing when we go into a new venue and we ring out the room and a PA. The brain is just doing it much faster and more precise. Okay? I would like to demonstrate that real quick to you. For that, I'm going to have to turn off my mic, because it won't work otherwise. Wait. We're recording this, so I'm just going to turn it off over here. Otherwise, I would be in trouble with Josh. Alrighty, so now you can hear me only acoustically, right? I want to demonstrate to you how strong those colorations are, because even us audio people often don't really realize how strong those colorations are. For that, I'm going to need you to trust me for a second and close your eyes. You need to isolate your hearing. It only works if the eyes are closed, right? Don't worry, I don't do anything bad. I just want you to focus on the sound of my voice and the frequency content of my voice while I'm walking around you, while I'm in different angles around you. Now I'm behind at least most of you, right? So it sounds quite a bit different. If I come back to the front, it sounds different again. For the most of you, I'm at a higher elevation than your heads. If I go roughly on the elevation of your heads, it sounds different. And if I go lower, it sounds quite drastically different. You can open your eyes again. Who did not hear a difference? Good news. I guess you can keep your jobs. That's very good news. So you might have been surprised how strong those colorations are. And that's completely normal, because our brain is just intuitively all the time counteracting that, making sure that we perceive audio linear. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to even do a front of house job, because just turning our head a tiny bit changes actually the frequency content that we perceive, right? So that's something that our brain just does all the time, from morning till night, since the first day of our lives. And it's very good at that. And that's why we just don't notice that. Why am I telling you that? Essentially, we are emulating those three factors, plus some secret German sauce, in real time for any input that we're sending into our processors. And we're encoding the audio with the information that your brain understands as a directional information. Okay? So it's a very simple principle. It was not super easy to pull that off, actually, inside the boxes, but that's it. And everything that I'm talking about from now on is about how your brain deals with that, right? What your brain does with that and how we can use that in our mixes. You might have heard of the famous cocktail party effect. Let's say we're having a party over here. Let's say we have a couple of more people in here, everyone is chatting, some music is playing, actually quite similar to what we had before I rudely interrupted that. And let's say you and me are trying to have a conversation. Theoretically, that should be relatively hard because, you know, just the noise from everyone talking, glasses clinking and so on, would be at least at the level of our voices. And as you know, if we would put a microphone between us and try to record our conversation, it would not be very easy to actually understand afterwards what we're talking, right? However, we know that being in the room, it's quite easy to have a conversation. Or even a more extreme example, being at front of house and having a conversation with our lighting engineer, where the PA is, in nearly every case, quite a bit louder than the other voices. Our brain is able to focus on a direction of sound that is relevant or interesting for us at the moment. For example, to a conversation partner. And we are hearing that louder or clearer than it actually is. And we are ignoring or at least turning down or tuning down all the noise that is not relevant at the moment, right? Let me just turn off my mic again for a second. Even now, I mean, I don't have to scream, I don't have to talk very loud, and still you can understand me quite well, right? Because this is a super quiet room, so that's ideal circumstances for that. But if I ask you, don't listen to my voice right now, but listen to the noise around us, like the AC, some of the fan noises, maybe even something from the street might be audible. Did you notice how that suddenly became louder? Like somebody moved up a fader? That was your brain refocusing on a different angle. It's a completely intuitive process that your brain does all the time, every day, every wake minute. This is a very crucial part for us because it's protecting us from sensory overload. Okay? Otherwise, we would be very confused and we would never know what to listen to. It would be very tough for the brain, right? So that's a built-in feature to just protect us from stuff that is not relevant for us right now. A conventional stereo mix could be visually represented like that, right? So if we mix for our artists in stereo, we have to place all the signals that they have to hear on one line, one dimension between left and right ear. There's not a lot of room. If we're mixing let's say a jazz trio or so, it's probably not going to be such a big deal. If it's a modern production with a full band, maybe 2 guitars, keyboards, maybe even, you know, if it's a special event like a string section, a choir, some playbacks and so on, it gets quite crowded. And signals are living on top of each other. They're masking each other. And that creates a couple of issues. And we have to work with quite a few, you know, little tricks to actually make that happen. One of the tools that we're using for the most part is just that we are using quite excessive amounts of low cut and high cut, and we cut just everything in between just to find those little pockets for every instrument so everything can just cut through. In many cases, monitor engineers also use more dynamic processing than actually would be, you know, intuitive. Because in monitors, ideally we would not use any compression. Because the more control the musicians have of their dynamics, the better they will play, the better they will find their place in the arrangement. However, if we have a stereo mix, there's a lot going on. Softer signals might just get lost. And that means sometimes we just add some compression just to make sure they don't get lost. You know, so we have to deal with quite a few compromises with that. If we have an immersive mix, it's a different situation. Rather than picturing it like a one-dimensional line between left and right ear, we can picture it like a transparent sphere around our head, where we just pin all the signals wherever we want to have them. The vocals, the guitars, the keyboards, the bass, the drums, and so on. And if you picture it like that, it becomes relatively clear that there is a distance between those signals. And that distance is something that we perceive as transparency. Because it's as simple as that. If two signals are not in the same spot, they're not going to be in the way of each other. Okay? So that's quite an advantage. And more than that, we can also focus on certain areas around the head. In the same way that I could guide your attention before to the fan noise and the AC noise around us, right? We can also do that with the signals in our immersive mix. A prime example for that would be the click in the drummer's mix. Do we have drummers here? No? Okay, good. So I can be very honest. So, why do drummers request such loud clicks? I'm not sure how it's in Australia, but I always am scared to cue into the drummer's mix because I know the click is going to split my head, right? So the reason why drummers request such a loud click is not only because they're crazy. That is one factor, right? But it's not the only one. Because the drummers always want to have this anchor in time. They want to make sure that no matter what happens, they always can find the click, so they make sure that they don't drift off the playbacks, for example, that are coming in, right? And that just leads to the click often being quite a bit louder than the rest of the mix. It's living on top of the mix. If we have an immersive mix, we can typically embed the click into the mix. It doesn't have to be louder than all the rest, right? And as long as the drummer is playing in time, everything is fine. We don't need to split our head with the clicks, right? But as soon as the drummer starts drifting a little bit, the first thought is, I need a click. And that thought is enough for the brain to look in which angle the click is positioned. Ah, it's there, cool. And we just hear that clearer than it would actually be in before that, right? In the same way, again, that I could guide your attention before to the fan noise, right? So that's a completely intuitive process. Sounds a little bit like black magic, but that's just how our brain works, okay? Right. Let's talk about a couple of psychological factors. So let's say I'm a rookie monitor engineer, right? I'm booked for the first ever tour for myself, and I'm about to go into rehearsals with a band, and of course I want to impress them, I want to do a fantastic job. And the lovely folks here at GT offered me, hey, you can come in, you can tip a console, you can put a couple of multi-tracks, you can prep your show. So I'm doing that, and I'm doing a record-ready mix, it's like Grammy material, right? So everything is super balanced. I have clear and crisp vocals. They're embedded into the piano. I have punchy drums, a super fat bass. So everything has its spot, right? And then the rehearsals are starting, and within a couple of minutes, my vocal mix will look like that, right? So suddenly, the vocals would be very, very loud in the mix. The piano as harmonic context that helps the singer to find a pitch would be also pretty much there. And my nice and punchy drums, my super fat bass are getting lost a little bit, and some other signals like backing vocals and an acoustic guitar might just get kind of fall off the truck, right? That is because the only tool we really have to create a priority for what our artists are hearing is level. There's not much more we can do, right? In an immersive mix, again, it behaves a little bit differently. We have some more tools, not only level, to create a priority. We human beings are sensitive in a special way to some areas around our head. And there are two areas that are especially important for us. One of them would be right in front of me and slightly higher. So for me, it would be roughly this area here. Signals coming from that area will always have a priority in our perception. It's like a fast lane at the airport, right? Whatever comes from there is going to go directly into our active perception. Fun fact, acoustically, that's one of the weakest spots because the sound is passing our ears, right? On a psychological level, it's a different story. The reason for that is partly how we grew up. When we were little kids and our parents were talking to us, they were mostly talking to us from an elevated position. So some of the very first important audio cues that we perceived as little pre-sound engineers were coming from that area here. But also on an instinct level, if an animal would be threatening or dangerous for us, in most cases it would be physically taller and bigger than us. So our brain is conditioned to always pay attention to that, right? Especially important for drop bears, as I learned. Right, and we can use that in our mixes for the signals that usually would be very loud in a stereo IEM mix. If we place those signals into this focus area, how we call them, we can usually turn them down by around 6 dB compared to a stereo mix, which is quite drastic already. Because again, we don't have to create a priority through level, but we can do it to placement. And then there's another area around our head, which is slightly out of my field of vision and a little bit lower, bless you. So would be roughly this area here. Okay? Signals coming from that area are perceived as not important, but also not dangerous. And that is a position where we can place signals that our artists don't need to pay attention to all the time, but that are filling up the mix, that make it big and fat and rich sounding, but also give us context about our place in the arrangement. Right? It's a quite important thing to figure out on the dynamics, what we're playing, on the frequencies, or the notes that we're playing actually, the ranges that we're playing. A great example for stuff that really works well in that area is a distorted guitar. Is any one of you working with rock or metal bands? Yeah? Okay. So high-gain guitars are relatively tough to work with in in-ears, right? Because a high-gain guitar is essentially awesome-sounding pink noise. It's filling up the entire frequency spectrum. And in most in-ear mixes, they're very, very hard to handle because either they're not loud enough or they're covering something, right? So that's a little bit difficult. If we place those high-gain guitars into this area here, we don't even have to cut them down frequency-wise, which is always, something that creates issues with our guitarists who spend half a mortgage on their guitar rig, right? And then we come and cut it down. We can leave them big and fat. We can actually turn them up quite a bit louder than we would be able to in a stereo mix. But whatever happens there is never in the way of our literal center of attention. So something that used to be a contradiction in a stereo mix is suddenly not a contradiction anymore. Both of them can just live side by side peacefully, right? Next thing I want to talk about is only half related to Klang, but I think some of you might have had some experience with that. I see some musicians smiling. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean it's quite a widespread disease globally that some musicians are taking one in-ear out, right? We have a few musicians here. Do you do that occasionally? Rarely? Good, good. What about you? Yeah. You do it? Yeah, okay. Don't worry, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm not judging here, because I'm sure you have some very good reasons why you do that. What brings you to do that?
The mix isn't right.
The mix isn't right? Yeah, okay.
It's not right.
Yeah, it's not right, okay. You might also feel a bit locked in, missing a bit, orientation in there. And also, especially for singers, it can be an issue to just have a little bit of a lack of interaction with the audience, right? I mean, of course, we put ambience mics in there, but what we monitor engineers usually do is just ride that fader all the time, right? Which is a relatively bad compromise. I mean, we do that because it's the best thing we can do, I mean, while the band is playing, we turn them down, so we have actually a clear mix. While there's interaction with the audience, we turn it up. But what happens if there's interaction with the audience while the band is playing? That's already where we're in trouble, because it's very hard to find that balance that actually works. And the ambience mics will change the mix quite drastically, right? So it kind of prevents a mix from being consistent. So that's already an issue, right? So I said it's half related to Klang. In case you don't know this, I would like to give you a little experiment that you can just do, tonight or somewhere whenever you have time. It's a really interesting one, and that's something you can also do with your artists in case you don't know that yet, because it's a thing to teach artists why that is a bad idea. Okay? Because you probably have all the time sound engineers nagging your brains about that. It's not just because we're your audio moms. There's a reason or several reasons why we don't like you to do that, right? And one of the most important ones is just that it's actually very dangerous for you, right? There is a very well researched phenomenon called binaural summation. You can Google that. There's quite a few white papers on that. And there's a little experiment that we can do to just see how that behaves in action. That goes as follows. You put both your in-ears in, and you just play some music through a headphone amp, right? And you turn it up until you find a comfortable listening level. And then we mark that position. We turn it down. You take one in-ear out, and then you turn it up again without looking, and you find the same listening level that you were listening to before. And you're going to end up at pretty much exactly 10 dB more. That is more than 3 times that. So, in order to get the same perceived volume with one in-ear in, you need nearly more than 3 times the volume to get the same perceived level. So that is a lot that you're just shooting to one ear, and that is going to damage your ears. Okay, so that's very, very dangerous. But as I said, there are some legitimate reasons why you're doing that. And I said it's half related to Klang. We cannot fix that part. However, we have been able to cure quite a few musicians of that disease. Because that's something we get reported back quite a lot from musicians as well as sound engineers, that in many cases musicians just forget to take one out. Because as soon as we have an immersive mix, the audio behaves like an acoustic scenario, right? So we have the orientation, we have the separation between the signals. We don't get so tired from that. We get to that in a sec. And also, communication with the audience is much easier, because in a typical Klang mix, we don't turn off the audience, we just keep it in, right? Because we can isolate the audience to a certain area, and we can have a really big and fat audience there that is in the mix all the time, and this is not a contradiction to a dry and snappy drum set behind us, right? Again, that's another factor where a former contradiction is suddenly not a contradiction anymore, okay? So that's quite helpful in that respect. I just mentioned hearing fatigue. Hearing fatigue is a big issue. And I'm sure that everyone in this room knows hearing fatigue, knowingly or unknowingly, or at least the effects of hearing fatigue. Listening to a stereo headphone mix is very tough for the brain. It requires an active process and a lot of energy-consuming focus and concentration to figure out the differences between the individual signals that we're hearing. And it takes the brain about 1 to 1.5 hours to give up. It gets too tough, right? We notice that by, let's say, we're doing sound check with the band, right? Everything's fine, band says, cool, ready to go, let's shoot. And after roughly 1 to 1.5 hours, some musicians will ask you, hey, did you change something in my mix? And you know you didn't. That is hearing fatigue, okay? Because a mix that was kind of working before is suddenly not working anymore because our brain raised a white flag and says, I'm giving up, this doesn't work anymore, do something. So a mix that seemed to work before is suddenly not working anymore. So who do we blame? The monitor engineer. That's normal. We have a thick skin. We can handle that. But still, that is the issue that we're having. It's not such a big issue if we just have a rock and roll show of 1 hour, you know. But if we have a longer rehearsal, a studio recording, a theater show, you know, that's where hearing fatigue is becoming a really, really big issue. If we have an immersive mix, it behaves like an acoustic environment, right? So hearing fatigue simply doesn't exist, right? Because the separation and the understanding what is the differences between the individual signals that we're hearing is not happening through a lot of focus or concentration, but it's happening on a spatial level. That's something that our brain is very good at because it does the same thing since the first day of our lives from morning till night. It's very good at that, it's very easy for the brain, and it doesn't require an active process, it's actually a passive process for the brain. And basically the finely dissected signals are presented to our active perception on a silver platter, right? So the brain just doesn't get tired from that. In the same way that you don't get tired from walking through the forest and, having birds tweet around you, right? It's not a big deal, it's fine. Also, sensory overload is not happening because, as we demonstrated before, we can just focus on whatever is interesting for us right now. And those are completely intuitive, natural processes that our brain does all the time, right? So, hearing fatigue is not happening anymore. You get tired from performing, from heat, from light, and whatever fun stuff might be happening backstage, but you're not getting tired from the hearing portion of it, okay? Big difference. On to one of my favorite topics. That's a cool one. Open microphones. On pretty much every live production, we have a ton of open microphones, right? The drum set alone is usually having quite a few on them, right? And microphones do what microphones are supposed to do. They pick up sound. Unfortunately, they pick up every sound, not just the sound that we want them to pick up, right? Of course, we have polar patterns and all that stuff, but still, they pick up whatever is in the vicinity, right? And that leads to multiple microphones picking up pretty much everything that is happening on stage. Let's take a snare drum as an example. It's a great example for that. So let's say I have a nicely tuned snare drum. I have a drummer who hits it with a really nice rim shot, and I have a very clear transient signal. It's a very clear, strong, and snappy signal that I have in there, right? And then that gets picked up with a minimal delay, just due to the distance, by the snare top microphone. With a little bit more delay by the snare bottom microphone. A bit more delay, just again, due to speed of sound, by the hi-hat microphone, by the tom microphones, by the right microphone, by the overheads. And the overheads are, in many cases, they're like 1.5 meters above the snare, right? That is already 4.5 milliseconds, right? But it doesn't stop there. They also get picked up by the guitar cabinet mics, by the backing vocal mics, by the lead vocal mics, and in some cases even by the ambience mics. So we're getting that same signal picked up by many different microphones, but in different times, right? In a monitor situation, we cannot really do a lot against that. Front of house sometimes, broadcast definitely, studio sometimes, right? We can just delay signals just so they're just locked in again, right? But in a monitoring situation, that's going to be tough sale, to just say, hey, I'm going to delay your entire feed by 30 milliseconds. Might not work that well, right? So what happens if we just fold that down to a stereo mix or mono mix? Everything is laying on top of each other, and instead of one clear transient, we have a little bit of a cloud going on there. That's what we perceive as a muddy sound, right? And actually, a very similar thing is happening if we're talking like this. Again, if I turn off my microphone, my voice sounds very dry. You can understand me quite well, minus my accent maybe, but the pure audio part of that is not very hard to pick up on, right? But we all know, even in a dry room like this, if I would put a microphone here now, and if I would record what I'm doing, my voice would sound much more roomy than you perceive my voice now right now, right? That is because the systems engineers will know about that. You might have heard of the rule of the first wave, right? So our brain is always paying attention to the first signal that is arriving at our head. Because right now, again, without the microphone, you hear my voice multiple times. You hear it on the fastest way, on the direct line, from my mouth to your ears, right? But you also hear reflections from the chairs, from the floor, from the ceiling, from the walls, from everywhere, right? So that is happening all the time, but your brain just knows, okay, so the fastest signal, that is the direct signal. All the reflections are going to be a little bit later because they take a detour. So your brain is using that as acoustic reference, you know, to have an orientation and an impression on the room that we're in. But it only pays attention to the first wave. Okay? And that makes it very clear. So the same thing happens in an immersive mix. If we have all those microphones spread in different locations around us, then your brain will pay attention to the first wave. And all the other ones which are in different positions will be interpreted by your brain like reflections, like the reflections that you perceive now from the chairs, from the wall, from the ceiling, from the floor, and so on. Right? So your brain just kind of ignores those, and you hear them clearer. Okay? So it's quite fascinating stuff. It will just interpret them as what they are, as distance. Okay? Questions? Did that all make sense for you? Any? Yeah? Yeah? Oh, fantastic. Either you're very polite or I actually did a good job explaining it.
We're very smart.
That's fantastic. Very, very good. I mean, most of the stuff that I was talking about is, I mean, it's not new. It's just how our brain works, you know. And as I said, I mean, the majority of the stuff that I was talking about was just about that, how our brain deals with audio in an acoustic scenario. We just happen to, you know, bring that into in-ear monitoring. And that is the basic idea behind what we're doing. As I mentioned at the beginning, we don't do this for entertainment. We're Germans, we don't do fun. Right? We just do it for a very pragmatic reason, right? Across the last 20, 25 years, we have received more and more toys to make our jobs more interesting, better in many cases, you know. We have better mixing boards, we have more possibilities. We have the possibility to sometimes even implement a couple of plugins or something like that, right? But all of those only worked on symptoms of an issue, right? And that's something that we wanted to do differently. We said, okay, instead of just working, you know, just putting like a bandage on a broken leg, which won't make a difference, let's just fix it at the root of the issue, right? And just give your brain the acoustic environment or the auditory environment that it can actually deal with in a proper way, that it's used to and that it's actually designed to, okay? That's the whole idea behind that.